This is essay number 4, Hephaestos, A Pattern of Introversion by Murray Stein. This appeared in Facing the Gods, which was edited by James Hillman. And I should have silenced my phone first. All right, so Hephaestos, A Pattern of Introversion. The murals on the walls of the Detroit Museum of Art, commissioned by Ford and executed by Diego Rivera, depict scenes in the life of the industrial worker. Heavily muscled men wielding wrenches and hammers, massed together around glowing furnaces and along endless assembly lines. Some of them wearing gas masks, others struggling mightily with glowing ingots of red-hot steel. Neatly dressed managers of the industry stand off to one side, plotting how further to direct this mighty force of labor to their best advantage. In some of the upper panels, heavy-breasted, primitive-looking women are bearing children, the next generation of exploitable workers. The whole of this impressive painting is suffused in a noxious, greenish light that gives the scenes a distinctly underworld tone. Ford, it is rumored, was not pleased when he saw what his money had paid for. The Marxist image of the proletarian worker masses may be largely a Hephaestian fantasy. The rejected of the earth, by whose labor and sweat civilization has grown, class conscious and seething with pyromaniacal resentments and grudges, endlessly creative and the source of most of the world's supply of genius, restless, volcanically explosive, and ready to take up arms against tyrannical masters, yet not lovers of war and strife, but rather peacemakers and natural humanitarians. Simple as fire itself and equally energetic. As the proletarian worker is seen by the Marxists to be the workhorse of industrial society, so is Hephaestos, the only Olympian god who works. The workers of the world unite under the banner of Hephaestus, bearing something of the mark of an inferior child who has to take up a trade. Hephaestus stands on the fringes of the power circle that govern the Olympian world, a servant artisan figure who builds the palaces of the gods with skillful hands, and sometimes plays the court buffoon to the great amusement of his fellow Olympians. Hephaestus is a quintessential fringe person on Olympus. Included at the edge, he looks uneasily into the wheels within wheels that make up the Olympian social structure. But nervously and uneasily, too, he watches the power conflicts, remembering how Zeus seized me by the foot and hurled me from the threshold of heaven. I flew all day, and as the sun sank, I fell half dead on Lemnos. Trying somehow to stay in touch with the center, maybe to be ready for the worst or to know what's coming next. He knows all the while that it's impossible. He knows all the while that it's impossible really to belong there, where they tolerate the fringe people, as long as the work gets done, but where they can never act and feel quite easy and neighborly with them. Hephaestos' consciousness drifts a bit toward the Frankenstein phenomenon. His brother is the monster Typhon. But that goes beyond the fringe of Olympian society. The feet of Hephaestus tell volumes. They are turned back to front, and when he walks, he goes with a rolling gait that strikes the other gods as somehow hilarious and breaks them up with mirth. Quote, a fit of helpless laughter seized the happy gods as they watched him bustling up and down the hall. End quote. On this particular occasion, his buffoonery has the effect of keeping the gods from each other's throats. In one story, the feet of Hephaestus are misformed at birth, and Hera, his mother, goes into shock. She had bred and borne him by herself to show Zeus what she could do without his help. grabbing him up and flinging him with disgust from the portals of heaven. This boy child was supposed to be something she could hit Zeus over the head with, to show off with, to prove that she was as good as he. He had given birth, through his head, to the mighty and highly respected Athena. Instead, to her acute disappointment, this misformed cripple shows up her inferiority and embarrasses her, and this, of course, is intolerable. The crippled child threatens to put her on the fringe, too. The other version tells that Hephaestus' feet were crippled when he hit the ground on the island of Lemnos, having been hurled from Olympus by Zeus, who had a fit because the boy was sticking up for his mother, Hera, in one of the many quarrels between the royal pair. As a rule, Hephaestus remains close to women. He's not much in the company of men, except for the blacksmiths. Zeus sometimes passes for his father, but most stories tell that he had no father, only a mother. And since it is generally the father who shows the boy the ropes of society and leads him into a position, etc., it begins to make sense why he is so much on the edge of things in the patriarchal, masculine world of the Olympians. Rejected by his father in a rather no-nonsense, brutal way, Hephaestus lands on Lemnos, where he makes friends with the Sintians. Lemnos becomes his home away from home. In fact, this island may be his original home. There was on Lemnos a tradition of Hephaestus worship on the part of the native inhabitants, those, quote, foreign-tongued people, the Sintians, end quote. This island home of Hephaestus throws much light on his background. The island of Rhodes, Samothrace, Delos, Lemnos, were much associated with a race of creatures variously called dactyloi, telkines, chorites, corybantes, or kabiroi. On Lemnos, they were called Hephaestoi in the plural. These names refer to dwarf-like servants of the great mother goddess. Invariably, they occupy themselves with metallurgy at subterranean forges deep in the body of the mother herself, for the islands were in earliest times identical with the great goddess. As the Edian dactyloi means fingers, thus, as the fingers of the great goddess. These smith dwarfs learned their metallurgic arts originally from the great mother herself. The dwarfish smiths are not only the servants of the great mother, they are also her sons and lovers, her son husbands. It will be remembered how she, quote, it will be remembered how she, the great mother, always had with her dactyloi, chorites, corybantes, or kabiroi, whom she had bred from within herself, and with whom she also bred further, end quote. The name of his mother-wife was sometimes Kabiro. She was the mother of the Kabiroi, and her name was variously transmuted into Rhea, Demeter, Hecate, or Aphrodite. When Hephaestus mated with Kabiro, she bore the boy Kakmylos, who again, in turn, mated with her and bred the three Kabiroi and their Kabirian nymphs. Hera, the Olympian mother of Hephaestus, preserves associations from earlier pre-Olympian times with beings of a dactylic nature. The importance of this incestuous pattern in the Hephaestian configuration is central. Invariably, the mythical smiths were set apart by some physical defect or oddity. Often, also, these dwarfish, crippled, or otherwise mutilated craftsmen were, according to Iliade, associated with strangers and mountain folk, that is, with primitive populations of, quote, unfamiliar character who were surrounded by mystery, end quote. Undoubtedly, this cripple motif, as well as the mysteriousness of these populations, hangs together with their incestuous bond to the Great Mother. Here we can perhaps see what lies behind the outcast characters of Hephaestus. He is a fringe person and slightly monstrous because of his connections with the historically and psychologically regressive servant-son lovers of the Great Mother. This dactylic background places Hephaestus also in proximity to the magical arts of the underworld. the left-handed dactyloi. Those who originated from the fingers of the goddess's left hand were magicians, and the cousins of the Kibiroi of Lemnos. The Rhodian Telchines were famed as evil magicians. Hephaestus cannot be separated from his fires. In fact, his name is said to mean fire. Sometimes, too, he is called Ephoros toi Puros, ruler of the fire. Or, again, his breath is fire, and his glance is a blaze. But the fire of Hephaestus is fundamentally not a daytime Olympian fire, but a subterranean fire. And here he connects with the Roman god Vulcan, who ruled over and in the volcanic Mount Etna on Sicily. The Hephaestian fire per se sprang from a hole in the earth on Lemnos, quote, on the small mountain of Moschelos, where his companions were called Kibiroi, called the Karkanoi, the crabs, end quote, alluding perhaps to their strong fingers and masterful hands. Another association connects Hephaestus to a pre-Olympian background. In one story, Hera brings the baby Hephaestus to the island of Naxos and hands him over to the Kedalion, who is supposed to act as his tutor. The name Kedalion, quote, was as much as to say the phallic one, end quote. Kedalion belongs to the ancient order of the Cyclops, who, besides the Titans and Giants, were the original children of Gaia and Ouranos. The race of Cyclops is intimately related to the great goddess of prehistoric Greek religion, both as her sons and lovers. His association to the dactyloi and to the Great Mother helps in explaining the surprising connection between Hephaestus and women's mysteries. In one set of stories, Hephaestus is the son of Prometheus, and the two of them are visited by Demeter, who brings them her mysteries, quote, just as she brought these to the king of Eleusis, end quote. His relation to the feminine mysteries of childbirth and fertility has its reason in the dactylic background. The Idaean dactyloi, those Idaean fingers, and I think it might be Idaean. It's Idaean. The Idaean dactyloi, those Idaean fingers to whom all the dwarfish smiths are related, came into being in the midst of the childbirth event. Rhea, worshipped in Asia Minor as Meter Oriah, Mountain Mother, had fled to Ida to await the birth of Zeus, and there, when the time came, dew and labor pains set in, she supported herself with both hands on the soil. The mountain at once brought forth as many spirits or gods as the goddess had fingers. These spirits are the dactyloi and proceed to busy themselves in her service. These numerous connections between Hephaestus and the dactylic Great Mother pre-Olympian background would place the subterranean fire of the smith god in touch with the dark internal energies of the mother's creativity. The Hephaestian fire would take its light and energy from the central fires, which are at the heart of nature's creativity. Hephaestus is then a split-off animus of the Great Mother, who mimics the creative process in the depths of the mother and brings to birth through this transforming mimicry his work of art. Indirectly, Hephaestus has quite a lot to do with the origins of mankind. Out of his relations with the great mother goddess, Lemnos, unravel the first sisters for the primordial brothers, and these form three pairs, the first human couples. Until this possibility of brother-sister incest arises, the sons remain incestuously attached to the mother in a kind of pre-individual, anonymous, not yet human cluster. In another mythic tale, Hephaestus is again responsible for bringing the first woman into being. He formed Pandora. Hephaestus fashioned this first human image of women at the behest of an angry Zeus, who is contriving to punish mankind for possessing fire. Heretofore, the human race had been purely masculine, and to create confusion among them, Zeus asked Hephaestus to form the image of a beautiful maiden. The story is well known how Pandora opened the box and released misery, disease, suffering, etc. into the world, snapping shut the lid just before the last content, hope, could escape. What interests us here about Pandora is not, however, her character or what she may indicate about Greek prejudices on the subject of women. What catches our attention is Pandora's artificiality. The name Pandora, as Kerenyi, So this is Kerenyi. So as Kerenyi explains, means the rich in gifts, the all-giving. And this is significantly a name for the earth itself. In an old portrayal of her, Kerenyi remarks, the name written beside her is actually Anesador, the sender forth of gifts, which is one of the names of the earth goddess. Pandora is therefore a representation of the all-giving mother herself, which has been scaled down to human size through the arts of Hephaestus. But despite her lifelikeness and even her links to the Great Mother, Pandora is nevertheless made. She is an artificial product of skill and craft, but an artifact which resonates to the ground of nature in such a profound way that there is a kind of confusion between nature and culture, nature and art. Through Hephaestus, the Great Mother develops a primordial imitativeness, which is the source of cultural and artistic creative energy. The forge of Hephaestus is therefore the birthplace of spirit, this new creativity which nevertheless roots in and mimics the creative process of nature, is what the Hephaestian fire symbolizes. Some Renaissance fantasy supports this view. Because the Sintians were unknown to Renaissance scholars, they read Sintiis, Sintiis, variously as Absinthias, wormwood, nymphs, or Simias, apes. To justify the last reading, Boccaccio argued that Greek imagination gave Hephaestus to the apes because apes imitate man as man imitates nature. Man, he argues, imitates nature by practicing the arts and crafts. Hephaestus is the god of techne, which means, according to Aristotle, acting as nature acts. Thus, Hephaestus learns on Lemnos to ape nature and her creative processes. Boccaccio, and that's Boccaccio, goes on to imagine how Hephaestus, whom he naturally calls by the Latin name Vulcan, as fire, forms the foundation of civilization. That is, how the keeping alive of fire led to the formation of the first social units, to the invention of speech, and to the erection of buildings. Boccaccio's fantasy follows closely the model given in the Homeric hymns to Hephaestus. He taught men work that was noble, for men to do on the earth. Men who formerly lived in caves, in mountains, like animals. Now, on the other hand, thanks to Hephaestus, whose skill is so famous, they know how to work. Life is easy the whole year long, and they live it quietly in their houses now. This hymn praises Hephaestus both as god of work and as god of the civilizing process, leading man from the caves and forests through imitative work into his houses and palaces. The greatness of Hephaestian art lies in its naturalness. His works are praised generally for being so astonishingly lifelike. Examples of this abound. Homer heaps praise without end on the famous shield, which Hephaestus forges for Achilles, precisely for the vividness with which the several scenes on it imitate real life. This shield is literally jumping with life. Maidens and young men dancing, plowmen driving their teams to and fro, reapers taking the harvest, sun, moon, and stars shining brightly, and around the whole of it flows the cosmic river, the mighty stream of ocean. Indeed, the shield of Achilles contains the entire cosmos. All of nature is vividly recreated in this archetypal work of art. In miniature, we find the same phenomenon in the wreath that Hephaestus weaves for Pandora. In this wreath, many beasts of the earth and sea were wonderfully portrayed, almost as if they were alive. Perhaps the most ingenious example of Hephaestian artfulness are furnished by the female-like servants in his house. Golden maidservants. They looked like real girls and could not only speak and use their limbs, but were endowed with intelligence and trained in handiwork by the immortal gods. Sorry, that was a quote. The wife of Hephaestus, both in the Iliad and in Hesiod, is Aglaia, 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 the youngest of the Graces. Her name means the glorious, and Carini asked if she might not be a living work of art, for grace, cherish, means also the delightfulness of art. Through Hephaestus, the great forms of nature image themselves forth in art. His cousins, the Telchines, were the first creatures to build images of the gods. The springs of creativity, which are rooted in the depths of the Great Mother, take a turn in Hephaestus from concrete childbearing and body-centered sexuality toward the realization of the cosmos as imagination and symbol. The Hephaestian configuration remains deeply situated in the feminine mysteries of childbirth and fertility, and has little to do with the labors and efforts of masculine heroism. The forges and fires of Hephaestus are in the earth, in the womb of nature. The furnace itself is an artificial uterus, as Eliade has pointed out. The smith stands in the service of the metallurgic processes that occur in the furnace, just as the Idaean dactyloi served the Great Mother in her labor. Whereas the heroes of solar masculinity perform great tasks to free themselves from bondage to the maternal background, Hephaestus remains always in the service of the feminine, and the Hephaestian passion for creative work is deeply of the mother. This intimacy between Hephaestus and the feminine world finds mythic expression through an incident of his boyhood, when Hera flings him in disgust from the gates of heaven, and the crippled child falls into the sea and is rescued from drowning by sea nymphs, Thetis and Eurynome, who take him home and with them who take him home with them and nurture him for 9 years. The Greek word for where they take him is mucos, which means the innermost place, the secret place, but also the woman's apartments in the house. During the sojourn in the women's quarters, the young Hephaestus puts his talented hands to work for the first time and fashions for his surrogate mothers many beautiful articles of jewelry. These 9 years in Mucos represent, of course, a second incubation period for Hephaestus, and it is during this period that he learns of his ability to create. Years later, when Thetis comes to the master craftsman and begs him to fashion a shield for her son Achilles, Hephaestus forges the work that demonstrates the vast scope of his resonance to the primordial creative processes within the Great Mother herself. Shifting for a moment from the archetypal background of the Hephaestian configuration to more personal psychological considerations, it is not hard to see that a man whose ego consciousness is strongly influenced by the Hephaestian pattern will experience certain characteristic problems and proclivities. He will presumably find himself rather an outcast from a conventional world that requires ready adaptation to patriarchal and masculine dominance. He will be moody and given to swinging between inflation and depression. He will appear both to himself and to others, especially to the analyst, rather unheroic and uninterested in overcoming his close attachment to the world of women and mothers. Indeed, he will cling to feminine circles and company, fascinated by the mysteries of creativity and often lost in a world of inner images and fantasy, bound hand, foot, and soul to the excitement and anguish of tending the underground forges. He will seem to be quite anima-possessed, smoldering and crippled. Emma Young, writing of the image producing effect of the anima, describes a state of masculine ego consciousness which is close to Hephaestian consciousness in a man. Quote, the transmission of the unconscious contents in the sense of making them visible is the special role of the anima. It helps the man to perceive these otherwise obscure things. A necessary condition for this is a sort of dimming of consciousness, that is, the establishment of a more feminine consciousness, less sharp and clear than man's, but one which is thus able to perceive in a wider field things that are still shadowy. End quote. The analytic treatment of such a case of Hephaestian determination will be considered in connection with his association to Dionysus. For now, it is sufficient to point out that the creativity of Hephaestus depends absolutely on his intimacy with the feminine world, for it is only as he is able to resonate to the deep maternal creative movements within the mother that he can realize his creativity. To the feminine ego, the Hephaestian constellation may appear perhaps even more problematical and threatening. Hephaestus connects to her deepest feminine maternal impulses, yet wants something other than simple maternity. The Hephaestian animus represents a subtle undermining threat to simple, natural feminine creativity, in that he tends towards creating the symbol that mirrors the creative process of nature, but produces an artificial product which at once represents and substitutes for the real thing. Hence the monstrousness of Hephaestian creativity for the feminine psyche. Hephaestus goes contra naturam. His feet are turned the wrong way around, in a way that profoundly threatens to undermine or rechannel the essence of purely natural feminine creativity. Hephaestus may be, therefore, a monstrous offense to human Hephaestus may be, therefore, a monstrous offense to feminine naturalism, a sick-making disharmony in the tones that vibrate between feminine ego consciousness and the Great Mother. Returning to the Hephaestian configuration itself, we find in the contrast between the brothers Ares and Hephaestos several important points of differentiation that go far toward further clarifying the Hephaestian pattern. We come here upon a highly complex set of stories and motifs. The mythic links between Ares and Hephaestos pass through three nodes: their birth to Hera, both without paternity; the love triangle among Hephaestos, Aphrodite and Ares, and the rite of passage episode when Ares tries by force unsuccessfully to bring Hephaestos back up to Olympus. Like Hephaestus, Ares, which I've heard pronounced Aris, I don't know which one it is. I'm just going to say Ares. Like Hephaestus, Ares is born to an angry, jealous Hera. Zeus has offended her deeply, this time not so much by his promiscuity as by the affront of performing within himself the maternal task of bearing a child, Athena, and thereby demonstrating the superfluousness of womankind. This hermaphroditic act of the part of Zeus stimulates Hera to action. She does likewise. Her first effort results in the birth of Hephaestus. Later attempts bring forth the monster Typhon and Ares, god of furious warfare and battle rage. Hephaestus proves unsatisfactory in this competition because he measures up so unfavorably to Athena. Quote, "Without me, he has borne Athena," laments Hera, "who is glorious amongst all the immortals, whilst my own son, whom I bore, Hephaestus, is the least of us all." End quote. Dwarfish, lame, grotesquely comical, Hephaestus just will not do at all. But Hera's judgment of his inadequacy relates also to his deeper meaning. This anima of introverted contra naturam creativity, bound to the maternal depths and committed to a symbolic imitation of feminine creativity, simply does not begin to answer the extroverted challenge of Athena with her ear-splitting battle cry in a way that would satisfy the jealous rage of Hera. And yet, in a subtle way unseen by Hera, Hephaestus is precise response to Athena. From hermaphroditic femininity to hermaphroditic masculinity. If, as W.F. Otto says, quote, "Athena is a woman, but as if she were a man," end quote. Hephaestus is a man, but a bit as if he were a woman. Because she sees in Hephaestus a failure, Hera tries again and produces finally Ares. Whether or not Ares satisfies her is not said, but he certainly does reflect his mother's ferocious, battle-crazy animus. Ares, in contrast to the dwarfishness of Hephaestus, is gigantic. The epithet Artipus Ares, swift-footed Ares, calls attention to his further physical superiority over Hephaestus, who bears the epithet Epidanos, the weakly. In temperament, too, the brothers are very unlike. Ares thriving on strife and drinking deeply of the bloody waters of mortal combat. Hephaestus, rather, the peacemaker, who tends to shy away from conflict. But Ares is more than the split-off, battle-thirsty animus of Hera, though he surely is that. He is also the fructifier, the masculine impregnator. It is this underlined masculinity of his that distinguishes him sharply from Hephaestus, whose masculinity, in the sense of an aggressive, outwardly fructifying flow of libido, is clouded by his intimate associations with the world of women. The crippled feet give an obvious clue of problematical sexuality in the Hephaestian configuration, feet having definitely a phallic significance. I don't know how that is. The famous episode of the triangular relation among Hephaestus, his wife Aphrodite, and Ares, her lover, leads toward similar conclusions. Hephaestus, it is told, won the hand of Aphrodite as a reward for freeing Hera from the chains with which he had bound her. What sort of marriage this was remains in the dark, but it seems quite clear that Hephaestus spent much of his time on Lemnos with his smithy friends, leaving the voluptuous Aphrodite home alone to mind the house. Her affair with Ares began during these interludes and carried on while Hephaestus was introverting at his underground forge. It is marked by high erotic intensity. It is as though, in the coming together of Ares and Aphrodite, two sexual opposites meet which were simply not present in the Hephaestus-Aphrodite combination. Not that Hephaestus is at all effeminate and soft. The many drawings and paintings of him show generally a robust specimen of the masculine sex, with heavily muscled arms and thick neck, and he is, after all, god of the smiths and craftsmen. Hard hats. Probably the least effeminate element in the population. When Hephaestus' temper flares, the volcanoes rumble in the distance. With the strength of his arm, he turns his furnace on Ares and sends him flying back to Olympus when the war god comes to force him home, and his mighty deed in the Trojan War, scalding the river Xanthus with his dazzling flames, defeats any notion that Hephaestus is second best in battle. But the masculine fructifying libido in the Hephaestian configuration, unlike that in the Aries constellation, where it shoots actively and aggressively outward, instead moves in a kind of incestuous motion back toward the mother, toward the subterranean forges on Lemnos. Ares plays a secondary role in a story that tells of Hephaestus' return to Olympus and of curious connection between the young smith and Dionysus. Angry at Hera for rejecting him, Hephaestus seeks revenge by constructing a throne for her that will bind her feet and levitate. That will bind her fast and levitate when she sits down on it. After the trap has sprung successfully, and Hera has suffered a while the mortification and discomfort of hanging suspended in midair on this trick chair, the gods send brother Ares down to bring Hephaestus back to Olympus by force, but Hephaestus drives Ares off with several blasts from his fiery furnace. Next, the gods send down Dionysus, and this god uses a cunning ruse instead of trying force. Hephaestus has neither seen nor tasted wine before, and Dionysus tempts him to try a bit. The smith drinks deeply, again and again, and soon suffers himself to be led away. Dionysus returns to Olympus, leading Hephaestus, who is drunkenly draped over a donkey, behind him. But Hephaestus is not so witless that he fails to bargain for the freedom of his mother. Loosen chains in return for the hand of Aphrodite. This mythic link between Dionysus and Hephaestus comes at an exceedingly important moment in the development of Hephaestus. The crippled child has been cast out of heaven, has sulked and sought revenge, has learned of his creative gifts, but has not yet found his maturity. His return to Olympus represents a rite of passage to maturity, to taking up a position within the Olympian hierarchy. The agent provocateur of this passage is his binding of Hera. The bonds he has applied to his mother provoke the crisis and force the issue, but his maturity depends on loosening the bonds with which he has tied her. This act of loosening is effected through Dionysus and his intoxicating wine, as Hillman has pointed out. Quote, Dionysus was called Lysios, the loosener, end quote. Obviously, he is the right god to send on this mission, for loosening is precisely what is called for. Not only the loosening of Hera from her chains, but the prior loosening of Hephaestus from his idea fixi, which is bent on revenge against his mother. The hardening of Hephaestus is this attitude of irreconcilable bitterness toward his mother would spell absolute disaster for both, for it would leave the mother suspended and suffering in midair and the son cut off from the creative energies that flow into him through his contact with the mother. Caught in his own trap, Hephaestus would wither in the self destructive heat of resentment. A sort of anarchistic, self directed pyromania takes over in such cases, an attitude utterly devoid of creativity, rejoicing only in conflagration, even courting visions of martyrish death in the flames of his own kindling. The fire in the earth becomes an erupting volcano, and Hephaestus takes on the most terrifying aspect of his brother Ares and Typhon. Only in Hephaestus, this anarchistic violence would be directed not outward, as with Ares, but inward, against himself, against his own body and soul. Dionysus comes, then, to save Hephaestus from himself, from suicide. The two gods have several things in common. Dionysus was also born hermaphroditically from the thigh of Zeus. One story tells that Hephaestus was born from the thigh of Hera. Moreover, both gods have deep linkages into the world of women. Even more than Hephaestus, Dionysus is, quote, a man, but as if he were a woman, end quote. But whereas Hephaestus tends to tie down and fixate, a kind of compulsion to show them, Dionysus is the god of dismemberment, dissolution, and loosening. It is unclear where Hephaestus is when Dionysus comes to him, but one must suppose that he is still in the watery home of the sea nymphs, where he fell when Hera threw him from her. So Dionysus comes with his wine, with his spirit of drunkenness and eros, to free the fire of Hephaestus from its fixated imprisonment in water. By separating with his spirits the fire from the water, Dionysus from Hephaestus, from his submergence in the bitterly resentful negative anima, he frees the fire to follow its natural tendency upward, and by loosening Hephaestus, fixation frees him to touch yet more profoundly the creative energies in the core of the primordial Great Mother. Loosening means separating without cutting off, rather healing and freeing to take a new look, to sink more deeply, to rise higher, to become flexible and plastic. For Hephaestus is the solution to the mother hang-up, is not a heroic, aggressive battle against the maternal monster, but a kind of unfocused Dionysian intoxication which resolves his claims upon her. Hephaestus rides back to Olympus, drunken on a donkey, that phallic animal, and at the moment of entry into the Olympian gates, his claim transfers from Mother Hera to erotic Aphrodite. From this later union, by some accounts, the god Eros was born. The love of Hephaestus, which begin with Aphrodite, tend to conclude in disappointment. Behind these disasters in love lies the incestuous, mother-directed motion of his libido, already somewhat apparent in his triangular relationship with Aphrodite and Ares. This pattern is dramatically stated in the story of his love affair with Athena. The mythic ties between Hephaestus and Athena show, both in their quantity and profundity, a deep-going association between these two figures. More than Aphrodite, Athena is the soulmate of Hephaestus. Yet a kind of cloudy mysteriousness shrouds their relationship. No single tradition has ever clearly established on this subject, and so what confronts us is a blurred image based on rumors and conflicting reports. Despite this welter of tales, a few points seem fairly clear, and the general outlines of a myth emerge. Hephaestus was undoubtedly present at Athena's birth. Many drawings and paintings attest to his presence there. With his hammer, he performed a midwife role, releasing the goddess from the head of Zeus with a mighty, rending blow. It is highly significant that the contrasexually colored Hephaestus should be the instrument of Athena's birth, for she is too masculine Zeus as Hephaestus too feminine Hera, the product of a hermaphroditic birth process decisively marked by the contrasexual parent. The birth of Athena heralds a significant development on Olympus, for she represents that inner space and capacity for reflection within the masculine world which is capable of containing affect and the chaos of conflicting ambivalent feelings. That she is a contra naturam content is clear. First, because Athena springs fully armed from the head of her male parent. Secondly, because Hephaestus is her midwife, and the essence of Hephaestus is a spiritual imitating of the procreative processes within the Great Mother. The Hephaestian configuration would seem to have a liberating effect on the Athena pregnant head of Zeus. The mother-tuned, introverting Hephaestian attitude works on the dominant masculine attitude to release, loosen, free the Athena anima. Immediately, Athena springs forth with her far-echoing battle cry. Hephaestus falls into desperate love with her. In other versions, he first loves her when she comes to his shop for a spear, but always it is love at first sight on his part and a distinct coolness toward him on hers. Whether, as in some versions, he marries her or not, the outcome is the same. Hephaestus seeks impetuously and passionately to make love to Athena. At the moment of climax, she pushes him aside, and his semen falls on the earth where it impregnates Gaia. The child of this misadventure is named Erichthonios. The marriage of Athena and Hephaestus and the fruit of their union were celebrated annually by the Athenians in a fertility festival named the Chalkeia. This story of Hephaestus' semen missing its intended mark and fertilizing instead the Great Mother tells of the introverted, incestuous course of his libido, and the offspring Erichthonios symbolizes the outcome of this movement. Erichthonios is closely associated both in art and story with snakes. In some accounts, he is himself a serpent below the waist, or has serpentine feet. In other stories, he is guarded by snakes which curl around him in a covered round basket, probably such as those which are used in the mysteries. In some versions, he is even altogether a serpent, Chthonios. The stem of his name means sprung from the earth. And an epithet often applied to him is Geigines, meaning born of G, of the earth. The claim of the Athenians to be autochthonious, i.e., indigenous to their soil, rested on their connection to Erichthonios. For after his birth, Athena takes him up and cares for him, and when he comes of age, places him on the throne of Athens, founding the royal line that culminates several generations later in the famous hero Theseus. Hephaestus, then, not only mimics and transforms the creative energies in the dark maternal earthbound background of the psyche, producing his art and culture building artifacts, but also impregnates the mother with the incestuous, introverted turnings of his libido. And this impregnation of the psyche's fecund inchoate background gives birth to an image of a natural man, unsplit between instinct and spirit, Luna and soul, animal and angel, of man whose familiar is the snake. Perhaps it is to an imitation of this image of original man, at home with the earth, integrated, intact, intuitive, at one with himself, undivided by religion, unspoilt by civilization, creative, wise as the serpent, simple as his father Fire, and strong as his protectress Athena, that the Marxists have sung their paeans of praise. This Hephaestian turning of the libido back into the psychic depths fathers the birth of the ancestor spirit fantasy, that 2 million year old man, and activates the symbol, the numinous images of the gods. Okay, so now we're at the notes. There's a few notes. I'll just read because there's also a postscript on Hephaestos. Let's see. So this is note 31. It's the first one that's more than just a source listing. In some stories, Prometheus stole the fire, which he gave to man, from the Hephaestian forge of Lemnos. On the connections between Hephaestos and Prometheus. Like Prometheus, Hephaestus is a phosphoros, light bringer, and the heroic and tricky features which are so prominent in Prometheus are clearly lacking in Hephaestus, who is as simple as fire itself. Note 34 here. In the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, too, the identification between Pandora and Mother Earth is made. Deucalion, the son of Pandora, is told to throw the bones of the mother over his shoulder in order to create a new race of men. He obeys this command by throwing stones over his shoulder. Last note here that I'll read is note 44. P.E. Slater, in his book, The Glory of Hera, includes under the general heading Mythical Defenses Against the Maternal Threat, a chapter entitled Self-Emasculation, Hephaestos. Slater discovers in the Hephaestian configuration a defense mechanism. The son, rejected by a jealous, authoritarian father, Zeus, and a narcissistic mother, Hera, emasculates himself by elaborating the style of fool and jester, thereby taking himself out of competition with his father, saying, quote, "You have nothing to fear from me, nor is there anything about me which should arouse your envy or resentment," end quote. The industry of Hephaestus belongs also, in Slater's view, to the defense here against his mother, since he cannot present himself as an adequate object for, quote, maternal display. He can create objects which will function as substitutes in this regard, end quote. This, it seems to me, is the view of Hephaestus obtained by looking at him through the eyes of Zeus, through the paradigmatic grid of a heroic, mature ego. This view certainly has its validity, but it is one-sided and ultimately betrays the potentialities inherent even in the weakness and inadequacy of the child Hephaestus. What Slater fails to see, only because his method cannot cope with the inherent depth and subtlety of myth, is the pattern of meaning and movement within the Hephaestian configuration itself. And this reflects a fundamental failure of imagination. Instead of looking at and explaining myths through the concept of an ego-building psychology, a psychology governed, it seems to me, by Zeus and Apollo, we are trying to let myth instruct our psychology to broaden and deepen its visions and to move us out of our narrow preconceptions of, quote, what it means to be a man, end quote. Okay, so now I've got 4 pages left for the postscript on Hephaestus at 48 minutes. So get this done in close to an hour, which I imagine I could have just took pictures of the pages and then scanned them, and it probably wouldn't have took an hour, but this way I'll be able to listen to this material again as well. So win-win. Postscript on Hephaestus. I should like to address a question generated in part by the attention this article has received since first published some 7 years ago. What is the value, and what are the dangers and limitations of relating personal psychological material to mythical figures and themes? In our psychological interpretation, Hephaestus represents a possible pattern of self-organization, hence of human identity, with a characteristic set of complex inner dynamics and an internal relations among various inner figures. Imagos. The Hephaestian mythologism, including the various figures in the story as well as the tales, themes, and images clustered about them, may lead the psychologist to insight into individual psychology as well as certain aspects of group psychology, e.g., labor, management, relations, and struggles. The mythologism presents psychological structure and, in relation to groups, social structure. The architect of the Hephaestian mythologism, at work long ago in ancient Greece, is presumably identical to a psychological factor which continues to design and erect the same structures in the modern psyche. Besides giving voice to the depth of experience and relating separate pieces of experience into a configuration, the connection of personal experience to myth can produce or consolidate a psychological inflation. Assimilation of the ego by an unconscious, often archetypal content. The individual is unconsciously living a myth rather than a life. Most accurately, an unconscious content is living him rather than he it. Without going into the dynamics of inflation, it should be said that one telltale clue is the individual's inability to reflect in novel ways on his experience, his thoughts, and behavioral patterns. Inflation closes the doors to such reflection, and the person becomes locked in to a restricted field of vision. Suffering from inflation, a person has difficulty registering and responding to signals in the world around him. More and more rigid and maladapted, he misses nuance and complexity and gets lost in the simplification of a monomaniacal vision in which there is only one interpretation of experience, only one perspective, only one complex through which the world is screened and filtered. It is a great gain for consciousness to be able to identify the patterns in which one lives, through which one sees and interprets the world, by which one handles and deals with life. A mythical figure or a mythologem can be the means by which such a pattern of self-organization is raised. To be consciousness making such a connection to myth may then burst in inflation by creating a gap between the ego and the pattern which it is identified. But making a mythic connection may increase or consolidate inflation. When a pertinent archetypal pattern is named and claimed as my myth, tacit identification, already extant but somewhat unconscious, may be given added strength. Tendencies of action, perception, feeling increase intensity, and the I becomes more assimilated to a mythic or archetypal pattern. Finding a myth to live by may increase the grip of neurosis by justifying and rationalizing and aggrandizing it. While the individual has become further assimilated to an archetypal mythic pattern of feeling, understanding, and perceiving, the archetypal content itself is reduced to personalist terms and is thereby drained of its richness and complexity. This is the other side of inflation. Myth is drained of its archetypal resources, of its complexity, its power, its otherness. Hephaestus becomes a mere I. Hera becomes my mother. Zeus is my father, or the boss. The Olympic circle is the circle of colleagues closed to me, etc. In Jungian terms, the myth becomes a sign rather than retaining its force as a symbol. The great archetypal structures and powers are squeezed into the limits of personal life patterns and character traits, while the complexity of real persons is reduced to stereotyped roles. The numinous otherness of mythic persons collapses into family drama and suburban soap. Behavior and perception become stilted, monochromatic, and distorted as the grid of the archetype gets stronger, as in inflation, and the archetypal figures depleted. This leads me to suggesting another use of mythic sensibility, one which frees consciousness from its identification with a complex, releases it from an archetypally determined pattern, opens it to greater complexity of insight, yet preserves respect for archetypal forces. The archetypal patterns of self-organization reflected in mythical images and tales lie in the unconscious background of the psyche and act like psychological magnets that draw fantasy, behavior, and perception toward specific forms. The awareness of archetypal or mythic patterns and connections should consequently be present as a background and used for insight. As a force, the archetype is honored and respected, occasionally obeyed consciously, with the twin intention of maintaining awareness of it and preserving or gaining a certain degree of distance from it. This can allow the I to recognize a typical way the consciousness in which it is embedded gets organized. When the I is able to see beyond such patterns and the role it plays, to see into the pattern of tacit assumptions, relationships, and forces at work behind the conscious structures, it is, as we say, on the way to becoming psychological. This reflection on the archetypal background of consciousness, using mythical figures and tales, does not dissolve or even necessarily alter the constellating archetypal content and its force. It does produce a dual or reflexive consciousness with some distance between the embedded I and the reflected I. It is this distance that allows for seeing through our behavior, our cognitive structures, and our emotional action and reaction patterns. The organizing force behind these personal dynamics and structures should be honored. It has a meaning for the person in whom it is constellated. The archetype has answers to the questions it poses. The Hephaestion pattern, for instance, shows a way of working through the problem of a negative, rejecting mother and a remote, indifferent father, which have contributed to a crippling, self-demeaning attitude. Following the pattern through makes good therapeutic sense. The unconscious is wiser in most cases than consciousness, but the archetype is best and most therapeutically honored when honored at a distance, as a numinous force that both blesses the individual with its presence and inflicts itself on his life as a curse. The type of reflexive consciousness referred to above allows for this kind of honoring. It both participates with the consciousness embedded I, playing its part in the constellated pattern, and monitors this participation with the reflective I, as interested observer. Without this dual consciousness, the participatory I is simply a puppet of the archetype. When that is the case, I have found the pattern tends simply to repeat itself rather than lead to release and working through. Hephaestus keeps getting thrown out of Olympus, keeps trying to suspend his mother in midair, keeps on suffering humiliations at the Olympian banquets, keeps on withdrawing to Lemnos, on and on without resolution. The individual keeps on cycling through the pattern, deepened into the myth, however far he may be. How to create this necessary distance? A first step is realizing that living mythically is pathological. It is a state of inflation, of possession, unfreedom, one-sidedness, and stereotypy. It is the very contrary of wholeness, which is complex, made up of heightened tensions and contrary forces, of a mixture of myths complementing and contradicting one another. The pathology of archetypal possession is indicated as well by the fact of repetition without resolution. Finally, the pathos of this situation indicates pathology. The soul is in critical suffering. If this pattern of repetition and suffering is rationalized as meaningful by forging a connection to mythic patterns and figures, it becomes more deeply intractable. An instinct for the pathology of identification and inflation is the key to developing dual consciousness and the necessary psychological distance from archetypally determined constellations of consciousness. Another vital acquisition is suspicion. Most good psychological analysis is rooted in the impulse to suspect our unexamined state of consciousness. This leads to asking such questions as, suppose my absolute knowledge is not absolute, but rather the opinion of one figure in an archetypally constellated field. Does the I cling to and need a certain state of affairs, complete with allies and enemies, to feel at home in the world? Who or what creates the psychological world in which I live? The intuition of pathology and cultivation of suspicion can lead quite profitably to an act of repudiation. Identification with an archetypal content needs to be repudiated. Repudiation does not, of course, destroy or repress the repudiated. It creates a new sort of tension in the relationship with it. It creates alienation, hence distance. Finally, the sense of pathology and attitude of suspicion, combined with the act of repudiation, may well lead to unfaithfulness. The bond of loyalty to the one, the true, the only, is severed as the state of inflation and possession is seen through, and this leads to a quest for new gods, new sources of meaning, new myths. Out of this disloyalty and alienated quest, leading as it does into the desert of liminality, is born the ability to see from a distance. Like a son who, having left his family's values for other values and powers, one day returns and looks upon his father and his mother in lowercase letters and places them beside other significant figures in his life. This does not dispossess them of their parenthood any more than it dispossesses an originative, any more than it disposes an originative constellating archetype of its historical centrality, but it does strip them of their commanding mana. And as obedience gives way to reflection as a primary virtue, psychological monotheism gives way to psychological polytheism. Having said this about the necessary distance from archetypally sponsored inflation and possession, it is important to recall that archetypal consciousness does enrich experience, but its proper function is not to confirm pathology by providing a sophisticated rationale. Rather, it is to enhance the value and importance of human experience. For the psychotherapist, the understanding of mythic connections and the development of archetypal consciousness can furnish important hints for ways of working through certain types of psychological impasse. Finally, archetypal awareness can dignify certain forms of intractable and irredeemable human suffering, serving the therapeutic function of releasing a suffering soul from blind meaninglessness. Supposed to be a pause button. It's not up here. Well, wanted to, while I was at it, I think in the notes here, I think it was, yes. So this is on the necessity of abnormal psychology, which is Hillman's essay on Ananke and Athena. It's the first article or essay in this book, which it's also in the mythical figures from the Hillman's collected works. Anyway, this is note 40 from that in this book. I don't know if it's in the other one or not, but I wanted to read this because it applies to astrology. So for a rich discussion of the knees of the gods and Ananke's spindle, see RBO, pages 303 to 309. The myth of has provided a grounding image for Platonist fascination with astrology as a mode of psychology. The same necessity governs the soul's movements as well as the motions of the stars. As souls pass beneath her seat, so on her lap turns the spindle, ruling the planetary motions. What happens to soul and to stars is on the same web. So one tries to puzzle out the compelling necessities of the soul by consulting the motions of the planets. As Paracelsus explained, a physician of pathologies cannot consider himself as such unless he has knowledge of the other half of the soul in the planetary bodies. But astrologers have taken this correspondence literally, rather than imaginally. For it is neither the actual stars nor the astrological planets that are the rulers of personality. Astrology is a metaphorical way of recognizing that the rulers of personality are archetypal powers who are beyond our personal reach and yet are involved necessarily in all our vicissitudes. These powers are mythical persons, gods, and their motions are not described in mathematics, but in myths. So that may very well be the seed for archetypal astrology right there. And, and this book was published in 1980, but that was given at a talk, Eranos conference, which was like in 76 or something. So I thought that was interesting and wanted to read it. And that concludes this reading.